Just northeast of Eyeglass Lake lies the Unicorn's Cave, home of the next essence of nature, which Link will be able to reach after yet another trip down to Subrosia. While there, he'll need to pick a bomb flower for some locals in order to reach the final chamber within the Temple of Seasons and obtain the power of autumn. Finally, the ability to control all 4 seasons is at Link's disposal, and in autumn, these stone mushrooms can be plucked, allowing entry to the next dungeon. But before we go inside, I would be remiss if I didn't quickly mention the interchangeability of the dungeon order here. Technically, you can do Dancing Dragon Dungeon and Unicorn's Cave in either order. I stuck to this order in these videos because, well, I had to choose one, and since the dungeons are quite literally numbered in these games, as indicated by the dungeon title card shown when you enter them, and the hints that the Maku tree gives you also points towards this order, so I just stuck with that. But from a strictly gameplay standpoint, once you have the flippers, there's nothing stopping you from getting the autumn power, then heading into this dungeon. You do have to go a fair amount out of your way for it. The world design is clearly streamlined in such a way to push you towards Dancing Dragon first, but as I said, technically you can come here and do Unicorn's Cave as your 4th dungeon, and then Dancing Dragon as your 5th. And I should mention that either way you choose to do it upholds the tradition of 4th dungeons being a banger. The items from these 2 dungeons also won't gate you from the other one. The slingshot that we got in Dancing Dragon has no mandatory use case here, though I do personally find it helpful in combat, but it is not required. And as for the item we get here, since it was intended to be after Dancing Dragon by the designers, of course there's no use cases for it there. That said, while I think this is neat, a bit of deviation from the quote-unquote proper dungeon order isn't that unheard of in the Zelda series, but I felt it worth mentioning for the sake of thoroughness. Okay, with all of that said, let's head into the dungeon. Welcome to Unicorn's Cave. I mean, yeah, I guess it is shaped like a unicorn's head if you look at the map. This is a great dungeon. I think in terms of overall size that it's a bit more condensed than Dancing Dragon, with 31 standard-sized rooms confined to a single floor, albeit with an additional 7 side-scrolling rooms. That said, size isn't everything. The dungeon may be more compact, but it makes up for that by being a somewhat labyrinthian tangled knot, with navigation being a core theme here, rather than Dancing Dragon's micro-challenges. It's not as straightforward here as picking a path and moving room to room, with areas here being sectioned off and item gated frequently. I love this sort of dungeon structure honestly, but before we get more in detail about that, let's talk about aesthetics. Despite being called Unicorn's Cave, they don't really lean into that cavernous aesthetic all that much, aside from the wall texture, which has a fairly predictable stony look. Otherwise, the dungeon feels very man-made, with its patterned floor tiles, staircases, balconies, and intricate mechanisms. I think this may be one of the better looking dungeons so far in this game at least. The music here is pretty good too. Not quite as fun as Dancing Dragon's theme, but that's a high bar. I like it though, it feels purposeful, like I'm on some kind of march towards victory. But there's also this underlying tension in there, as if you could get ambushed at any moment, but you have to just push onwards. It's good stuff. Definitely one of Season's better dungeon themes. As I previously alluded to, this dungeon's progression style falls into the archetype that I affectionately refer to as the Big Tangled Knot. We've immediately got a huge amount of explorable space that is winding, twisting, and interconnected. Seriously, most of the dungeon is accessible to some degree right from the start, with 5 small keys and locked doors placed around the dungeon in critical locations, blocking access to the dungeon item, the mid-boss, the boss key, and the path towards the dungeon boss itself. So in short, this dungeon is all about exploring, zigzagging, and crisscrossing around a complicated network of rooms, finding those keys, and picking apart that big tangled knot bit by bit. If you've been keeping up with this series, you probably know this already, but this is my favorite type of dungeon, the type that almost feels like a miniature little Metroidvania. That openness is really appealing to me, but it's not so open that it lacks any substance or sequencing of any sort. I can't help but appreciate how well those locked doors are placed. It's just the right amount of restriction, done without undercutting that sense of exploration. Important things are locked off, so it feels deliberate in a way. You're incentivized to explore, to find keys, and make progress. I always find it interesting to see how many keys one can stack in their inventory within a single dungeon. Typically, the more linear a dungeon is, the fewer. In this case though, 1 key is needed for the dungeon item, but after that, you could find and hang on to the other 4 before spending any of them. And there's so much flexibility within the order that you tackle things here, but that employment of small keys means that you still have to do it all. It's still meaningful to the progression. It's also worth pointing out that the other 3 locked doors and 1 locked block, which is technically not a door, are also tucked behind obstacles that we need the item for, just as is the case with their corresponding keys, meaning that despite that you're often able to see those locked doors early, you won't be able to soft lock yourself. The key blocking access to the item has to be the first one you spend, but it's placed far into the dungeon, forcing you to explore. And yeah, not soft locking your players is like level design 101, but the more complex a dungeon is, the more impressive dancing around that soft lock really is for the developers. Speaking of which, after combing through most of the dungeon and finding our way to the northwesternmost point of the structure, we'll acquire the dungeon item, the magnetic gloves. An item so good, it genuinely is a top 5 Zelda item for me. This seriously might be one of the coolest things ever put in a video game. A simple idea that ends up having massive utility. As the name implies, the gloves are, well, magnetic, which allows you to interact with, you guessed it, other magnetic objects via their polarity. This isn't your Breath of the Wild magnesis, which had more to do with object manipulation than actual magnetism. There is still an element of that though. In case you missed the elementary school lesson on how magnets work, I'll bring you up to speed. And you can test this in real life if you have a pair of magnets. I never expected to give an actual science lesson in a Zelda video, but here we go. Magnets have a north and south pole. If you have 2 magnets, their opposite poles will attract. That's how magnets stick to things, or stick together. However, their matching poles will actually repel each other. Try sticking 2 north sides together or 2 south sides. You can feel them pushing each other apart. It's cool. Science. Back to Zelda. The magnetic gloves work exactly this way. Magnetic objects will have a N or S marking to indicate if they have a north or south polarity. You can change the polarity of the magnetic gloves at any time to either attract or repel objects, which allows you to manipulate them by pushing or pulling them by holding down the assigned button. However, if the object is stationary, like these cylinder things, then it's actually Link who is pushed or pulled in relation to the object, allowing you to cross over gaps or even pull yourself up to the ceiling to jump down from in these side-scrolling rooms. So cool. So what this means is that depending on the context of the object we are interacting with, whether it can be moved or not, and its polarity, that means we have the utility of items like a strength upgrade, item manipulation mechanic, and mobility-based item all rolled into one. Think of it like magnesis combined with the silver gauntlets and hookshot, all in one item. How freaking cool. With this much versatility baked right in, the sheer gameplay potential here is enormous, and it does not go unrealized. The puzzles and obstacles in this dungeon put this item to very good use. We can move these orbs onto switches to open doors. In fact, that is taught to us immediately in the room where we find the item, or we can remove them from this doorway to open the path forward, and even manipulate the orb from isolated other sections of rooms to complete puzzles, not unlike how Echoes of Wisdom would later do with its own bind puzzles. I'm particularly fond of this rotating mechanism that we first pull ourselves towards, then have to cling to, and then repel from once it has turned us the correct direction. And using the glove's magnetism to push upwards off the ground in these side-scrolling sections is incredibly creative. Let's not forget its combat utility too, since you can now remove the masks from these Helmosaurs, leaving them vulnerable to attack. From a gameplay standpoint, this is truly one of the most interesting dungeon items ever conceived. The only downside is the sound it makes. Every time you use it, for the duration of its use, it emits this high-pitched tone. It is genuinely terrible. Something about the exact pitch of it makes my hair stand on end. It's so bad that I remember during my first playthrough of the game, during sequences where I would be using the glove frequently, I found myself straight up just muting the volume. If ever these Oracle games were to get a remake like Link's Awakening did, well, aside from how good of a soundtrack could potentially come out of that remake, my one singular criticism with the magnetic gloves, the sound, could be fixed. We can keep dreaming, right? Otherwise, this ends up being The Legend of Zelda: Link's Tinnitus. That aside, the item utility wonderfully opens up the rest of the dungeon, while not neglecting on creative puzzles that you need to approach from multiple angles, sometimes literally requiring us to find different entrances into the same room to solve these. So clever. Once we have the item and at least one key, we can face the dungeon mid-boss, Saiger. Yeah, he's alright, I guess. Frankly, this is a pretty forgettable mid-boss for me. Saiger is a saber-toothed tiger that behaves nothing like one. He attacks by rolling into a ball and using a sonic spin dash. Okay then, his weak point is the conspicuous red orb on his tail. So really, the fight is all about avoiding or blocking his attacks, then smacking his tail with your sword enough times, and he'll go down relatively quickly. Your shield is particularly useful here. I will say that this is one of the more intuitive mid-bosses so far, but it's neither novel nor challenging like the Omoi or Agonima fights were, or even the Brother Goria with their formation-based battle in the first dungeon. This isn't to say it's bad, but it feels lacking in substance compared to what came before. I also think that a big saber-toothed tiger feels a bit out of place in a Zelda game. It always catches me off guard seeing this guy. But then again, this game also has a friendly boxing kangaroo, so it's not any weirder than that, I guess. Either way, this fight is fine. It's not bad, but it's not great either. Another note I want to touch on real quick is about Unicorn Cave's use of side-scrolling sections. These are present pretty consistently in the Game Boy titles, and I've kept my feelings on their usage for navigation no secret. That said, I think this is one of the better uses of them so far in the Oracle games. Either that or I'm softening my view on them. Hard to say, but hear me out. Usually when I have disliked these, it is because they have been used to bridge disconnected sections of the map, rather than just designing the layout and navigation in such a way to properly connect them. This can at times lead to parts of the map feeling weirdly disjointed. In Unicorn's Cave, there are 3 of these side-scrolling sections. The first one actually splits off into 2 pathways halfway through. Path A leads to this northwestern section, which is basically a disjointed part of the map, so it does fall under the category I described as one I don't really care for. Path B, that forks off from here, does naturally join back up with the main core part of the dungeon, so it's not bad. It's like a little detour and then a loop once we have the item. The other 2 sections, meanwhile, work better for me. One of them is a self-contained chamber where we'll duck down and do some side-scrolling gameplay, get the boss key, and return the way we came. So rather than being for navigation, it instead feels like a section just designed to play in this style, and it puts the dungeon item to use in a novel way that can only be achieved with this perspective. It feels more purposeful. The final passageway here is how we'll reach the boss door, so it is guilty of the same issue as the first to a degree, but at the very least it continues that novel and interesting gameplay via the magnetic gloves to balance that out, and you can reach an isolated section of this pre-boss room through normal means, and get a sort of tease here. So if you haven't found the passageway that connects here already, you'll at least figure out that that is what you need to be looking for, that you have to find the staircase that connects back to here, which isn't too far away. Though I pretty consistently find that passageway before I have the boss key, since you have to pass by it to get here, and so I end up having to turn around. So it sticks out in my head decently enough as a landmark, a point of interest to come back to, rather than muddling the navigation. And if you do find this one first, then the tease sort of works the other way too, since you can see the entrance to the other passageway. With all that said, once we've actually gotten the boss key, we can use the magnetic gloves to cross these chasms and confront the dungeon boss. Bouncing around the arena, ready to greet us, is Digdogger, the spiky eyeball urchin from the original Legend of Zelda on the NES. Since then, this has been Digdogger's only appearance, just as was the case with Aquamentus. Also, as was the case with the returning NES bosses, Digdogger got a huge glow up here. By comparison, this feels far more like the idea behind his design was fully realized, and he looks great. It's just the right amount of creepy, but not outright nightmare fuel. This is still a Game Boy Color game after all. In that original game, you could defeat them by playing the recorder, which caused them to split into smaller little Digdoggers, which could be easily dispatched. This time around, the boss has gotten a complete overhaul. It's far more mobile, leaping great distances across the room, and we must use the magnetic gloves to move this huge spike ball around the room and try to get it to collide with him. Eventually, after enough damage is dealt, he will also split into smaller little dudes, which you can then deal with, either with your sword or with the spike ball, which seems more effective from my testing, albeit harder to manage than your sword. So there's a payoff here of the harder method being more effective. If you don't deal with them fast enough, they'll reform into the big guy and need to be broken apart again, which reminds me of Valhalla from Wind Waker. Except of course that this game came first. This is a pretty fun concept, a really interesting reimagining of this classic boss. The only downside really is that it's a little too easy to accidentally damage yourself with the spike ball. It's not too bad once you've gotten the hang of it. It'll always slide a little rather than coming to an immediate stop, but either way, there's a learning curve that you must be aware of. But it's one of those things where mastery of the mechanic can really pay off, as once you do have a good understanding of it, you can turn this spike ball into an absolute force of destruction. A counterpoint, however, to my own point is that the fight is a little too short to have the opportunity to really gain that mastery. I only got there myself because when I'm recording gameplay for these videos, I tend to fight the bosses and then reload like 3 or 4 times in a row so that I have enough footage. Either way, it may be a bit gimmicky, but I really like this fight. It's a unique twist on an old school boss, and I think it's kind of a shame that we haven't seen a new version of Dig Dogger since this game, like we have with, say, Goma. And a modern adaptation of Dig Dogger could be a genuinely scary boss if done right, even if Big Eyeball Monster as a concept is a bit overdone. Once he's defeated, and he's defeated, and he's defeated, and he's defeated, and he's defeated, we'll find the nurturing warmth. The 5th essence of nature. Unless you did this one before Dancing Dragon, then I guess it would be your 4th. So, overall, this revisit to Unicorn's Cave really surprised me. It was never a dungeon that stuck out in my memory like Dancing Dragon did, but I really like it. It does just about everything right. There's tons of those little treasure chest teases, like we saw in Poison Moth's Lair, and a wonderful sense of satisfaction to be had when you start picking that tangled knot apart and figure out how you can get past all those obstacles that you couldn't before. The amount of puzzles the dungeon lets you catch a glimpse of before you find the solution in the form of the dungeon item is huge. I always like that sort of thing. It may be a slightly smaller dungeon in literal size, but because the navigation is just a little more complex than the prior dungeons, it more than makes up for it. There may be only one floor, but I love that meticulous Metroidvania style progression. That and the way the dungeon is so nicely interconnected, looping in on itself, it's great. I also have to applaud the way the dungeon finds time to keep old ideas relevant as usual. There's far less of a reliance on minecarts here, but they still find a place for them and the track switching, even if it is just in a small early section. Same goes for using the flippers. These returning elements keep the early moments through the dungeon interesting, before the second half of the dungeon runs with its own new mechanics, that being the use of the magnetic gloves, which genuinely may be one of the best dungeon items ever dreamed up. And after you've got those gloves, the rest of the dungeon opens up to you, letting you run freely, solve puzzles that you couldn't before, and round up keys. I alluded to the dungeon shape earlier, and I've been finding it interesting to compare these dungeons to the dungeons of the original Legend of Zelda. I think there is a vague similarity to the lion dungeon from that game, albeit flipped horizontally, but it may be a bit of a reach. Either way, I will say that I think this is the last dungeon in the game to have any remnants of that Zelda 1 remake that I mentioned way back when we were looking at Gnarled Root. That is, if this one even does have any relation here, or there's a decent chance that it is just a coincidence. You can only make animal faces look so different when drawing them out with map tiles after all, so don't expect me to keep bringing Zelda 1 dungeons up going forward, unless I find a point that's really relevant. A couple more stray thoughts I have. There's this one puzzle here in this room, where the room is divided in half. The 2 statues in here are magically connected in a way, so when you push this one, the other one also moves, but its movements are inverted. So we have to get statue number 2 to press down the switch on the other side of the room by pushing statue number 1 around. This is a super cool concept. I love this sort of puzzle. It's not overly complicated here. It shouldn't take you more than a moment to do, but it's so mechanically sound. My only critique is that the field of view is so limited that you can't actually see the switch when you solve the puzzle. So there's a sense of satisfaction that feels a little undercut. There's also this puzzle, in which we need to remember the order that we kill these 4 Armos in, and then open the 4 treasure chests that appear in that same order. This is a puzzle that also plays to the strength of Season's action-oriented gameplay. why. Because if you aren't good at managing combat and defeating these guys efficiently, they'll go ham and get mixed up all over the room. You have to control the battlefield here and be deliberate, or you'll lose track of the order. It's neat. Also, I can't figure out the point of this little balcony in this room right before we get the dungeon item. I think it would make sense if these push blocks could only be moved from the backside, so we'd have to jump down into this room from the balcony, and by extension we'd be forced to fight our way past the enemies in this room. But that's not the case. We can just push the blocks and then we're right beside the locked door and able to bypass all those p-hats and water tech-tykes. I don't know, it's hardly a big deal, but I always end up looping around the room twice because it throws me off and I don't want to miss anything. Regardless, Unicorn's Cave is solid. The only major fault here as far as I'm concerned is the absolutely abysmal sound that the magnetic gloves make. It's so bad it's almost painful. Is that melodramatic to say? But that is really the only bad thing here. Everything else feels like nitpicking. Besides, the way the item is actually used, the way the dungeon is laid out, and the way we progress through here, unravel it and solve puzzles, this may otherwise be a damn near perfect dungeon. Thank you so much for watching. Special thanks goes out to my channel members here on YouTube, as well as my supporters on Patreon, the names of which you're seeing on screen right now. And hey, also, the channel recently hit 25,000 subscribers, so thank you so much for that. You guys make this all worthwhile. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.